Good morning, everyone. This is Juan Pazos here with Justin Wales. And we'll be starting in just a couple minutes, giving some time for some other folks to join. We'll start in about 2 minutes. Thank you for joining us. Okay, everyone, good morning again. This is Juan Pazos. I'm a senior VP of White Island Paper Save and a principal of Morrison Brown and Visa Vera, hosting this event today. And I've got with me Justin Wales, who's the chair of blockchain and digital currency practice at Carleton Fields. And we're going to try to take you through blockchain and cryptocurrency this morning.
Yes, I'll introduce myself. My name's Justin Wales. I'm a lawyer at a firm called Carleton Fields, a national law firm. We have about 400 attorneys across the country with offices in New York and LA. I'm based in the Miami and the Los Angeles office mostly, but I'm doing quite a bit of traveling with this decentralized economy. I've been involved in the space for a pretty long time. I got in through some of the initial political conversations about having decentralized and censorship-resistant currencies. My background is in First Amendment law. And then over time, over the last several years, my practice has become more and more involved in the crypto and blockchain space. And for the last, I'd say, 2.5 years or so, it's been about almost 100% of my day-to-day practice. We represent people in on the investment side. We represent blockchain companies, token providers, as well as our legacy clients in the insurance, telecommunications, healthcare, logistics sector that are transitioning to a blockchain platform. We advise on the risks. And
Juan Pazos here, and I'm a software architect at MBAF, specializing in business process automation. The primary thing I work on every day is PaperSave, which is a document management and workflow product, providing solutions in accounts payable, donation and donor management, contract management, collaboration, and more. And my day-to-day is not blockchain, Bitcoin, and cryptocurrencies, although I've been following it since 2011, and like a lot of us in the software space, keenly watching it and learning.
Before you continue, we're getting a lot of comments about the sound. Where is the microphone? Okay, so let's maybe go a little closer to the microphone.
Sorry about that, everyone. And like most of us in the space, believe this innovation will continue to make an impact on IT and many of the industries that rely upon it. So before we get into the material, just a couple of quick ground rules. We'll be covering a lot, and we'll looking at the question log as we go along. We may stop to answer some of your questions, but We also have a Q&A section at the end of the presentation, where we'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. So please put questions into the question log as you think of them, and we will address them either as we go along or at the end. So the first thing we wanted to cover is, just for everyone, because everyone has this question, what is a blockchain? And to me, it's a design pattern for building software that ultimately results in a global ledger or database running on millions of devices. There isn't just one single blockchain. There could be various blockchains all tailored to a particular purpose. Interesting things about a blockchain are they're specifically for public blockchains accessible to anyone. And the way the technology works insulates it from hacking or alteration because of its distributed nature. Ultimately, it can be used to store a lot of different types of assets and manage the transfer of those assets, including things like monies, currencies, but also titles, deeds, identities, and many, many more. In some cases, it's even been proposed to be used as a system to manage voting because of its secure nature and its insulation from hacking and alteration. Ultimately, trust is built into the way that the blockchain is architected. So this is a really important point. In a lot of other software systems, trust is managed by the central party that manages the system. And, you know, to participate in a software system, you have to trust that that central party handles data security and manages transactions effectively. With blockchain, that trust is transferred to the architecture of blockchain and the participants who run it. Because all parties have a copy of the ledger and confirm the status and authenticity of the transactions, you're not relying on any central party. And you're also assured or given much more confidence that the architecture of the blockchain and things like consensus algorithms and, you know, ways that transactions are validated prevent the tampering of the data and make the ledger immutable.
So that's a very good, I think, textbook answer of what is a blockchain. But I'm just going to assume that a number of you who are listening to this are not paying attention to all the developments in the space and are really trying to get a basic understanding of what this is, what this technology is, what it isn't, what it, what it purports to be. So really what a blockchain is a linear database that can track the provenance of an item or of data across a decentralized network, and validating the that provenance is done not by a centralized third party that needs to be trusted, such as a central bank or a payment processor, but by all the participants in the network. So maybe it's important to talk about a bit about the history of the blockchain, which means a history of Bitcoin. It's really very difficult to try to completely divorce Bitcoin from blockchain because the blockchain was created to create the Bitcoin payment network. So in 2009, this is right at the height of our economic collapse, and a pseudonymous developer who called himself Satoshi Nakamoto published a 9-page document called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer cash system. You should go and download that and read it. It's, it's mostly still applicable, but it is the Bible to blockchain. And it explains the basic premise that we should be able to track data. In this case, it is data as a stand-in for, debts and credits, which is all, according to, the economist David Graeber, is all a monetary system should be. And it allows people to validate those transactions using different consensus mechanisms. In this case, it's a proof of work mechanism, which we don't need to go into because you guys don't really need to know what a SHA-256 hash is. But if you are interested, you should type in SHA-256 hash into Google, and there will be tons of videos and documents for you to read. So Satoshi Nakamoto puts this out. It wasn't ever supposed to be a new monetary system, a new currency. It was an experiment to see, can this type of validation process work on an increasingly larger scale. And over time, more and more people saw that there was some value, and the value came not because a Bitcoin is worth anything. A Bitcoin doesn't exist. It is just a metric for measuring a transaction and for keeping track of transactions. So the value comes as more and more participants mine or validate transaction, there becomes a network effect where it becomes increasingly difficult to falsify a transaction. And because there are things called nodes, which are basically full accountings of every transaction on the Bitcoin payment system, and those are decentralized, and I think at this point there are 13,000 nodes, including 2 that are going into space. You can't destroy a centralized database and say, okay, now I wiped out the complete record of all Bitcoin transactions because they are so decentralized. So that's the anti-fragility aspect of Bitcoin. Other characteristics of the Bitcoin blockchain are that it is censorship resistant, it is decentralized, it is immutable, and the immutability comes from just the scale of the large number of people participating in the validation process. So I believe that there might be a slide in this later on, but we're going to go sort of out of order, I think. In the slides, you guys can study on your own, crib if you'd like, and give your own presentations if you feel comfortable. I take no pride in authorship on this. The cost, I believe, is something like $2 or $3 billion in actual hardware, plus several $100 million of energy costs per day to even attempt to falsify a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain. And that number increases every time more and more people are participating in the system. So that's really the Bitcoin blockchain. What has happened since then is that people have said, well, there are maybe structural problems with the Bitcoin blockchain that my particular business or my particular needs need something different. So, for instance, the Bitcoin blockchain validates transactions in blocks every 10 minutes. Other blockchains have been created to have different types of different time sets for validating blocks, that have different mechanisms for validating blocks. So you have, you can Google some of these terms, but proof of work, proof of stake, delegated proof of stake, proof of reputation. There's all sorts of different models for how you validate. And then private industry said, well, you know what, we are nervous about the idea of a public permissionless blockchain, because what that means is that anyone has the ability to write a transaction or to propose amendments to that blockchain, and we don't want to have it to be that open. So maybe we should create something like a private blockchain or something called a federated blockchain, which creates some limits on who can actually participate. There are a number of authors who have written both positive and negative pieces about the ideas of implementing private blockchains. I personally think that a private blockchain is just, sort of maybe a less efficient database and doesn't have these really revolutionary aspects of a Bitcoin blockchain, which are that they are censorship-free and that they are immutable and that they are public. So therefore, it is a completely democratic record of a transaction's history. And we can talk about later on when we're talking about uses of blockchain, how that comes into play in actual industry. And if any of you have questions, feel free to write them in and we'll try to get them at the end. But I think that's my basic understanding of the history of Bitcoin, the history of blockchain, and basically where we are today with the different types of blockchains that are available.
I think that's very, very, very good. It's a great explanation. Thank you, Justin. So on the screen, and as we go through, just to try to reinforce some of this. So the blockchain ultimately is a ledger and chain of blocks. And as you can see in the representation, each block is created with a pointer to the previous block, and that's a little bit of the way the technology works. So as Justin was explaining, the creation of new block requires consensus, and consensus is there's various different mechanisms for producing it, and all the different methods ultimately add to the validity and immutability of the chain. Here's another visualization, just kind of reinforcing again that ledger's copied and distributed against amongst many nodes out on the world. And like Justin was mentioning, the more and more participants, the stronger the chain.
Yeah, and actually leave this up because here this is actually an interesting. The picture is clip art, but it says a distribution amongst nodes. There's a difference between nodes and miners. A node only, all a node operator does is hold a copy of the complete blockchain record. What the miners do is that the miners validate transactions, and they are rewarded by the network. This is in the Bitcoin network. They're rewarded by the network with a payment of, at this point, I think it is 12.5 Bitcoin every 10 minutes if they validate that transaction. And then every 4 years, that payment halves, and that is why it's a deflationary currency. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, and that was written into the code. So it's important to understand the different interest holders in the Bitcoin payment network. And really, that's what Bitcoin is it's not really a currency. It's not really store of value. It's a payment network that allows you to send payments in the form of this coin called Bitcoin anywhere in the world without having to go through a third party. And we're going to talk about in a few minutes the difference between Bitcoin and some of the other cryptocurrencies, because we have this issue in the industry of, it's a definitional problem, is that we try to apply principles to the entirety of everything that's related to blockchain or everything that's related to cryptocurrency. And the fact is that there's only one Bitcoin. There's several coins that purport to do things that are similar to Bitcoin, and then there are thousands of coins that are more akin to securities or more akin to products or more akin to actual assets.
Transfer of other assets.
Yeah. So we'll go through some of the differences in a couple minutes, and maybe by the end of it you'll understand that there's a million different variations on crypto and blockchain. Yeah. So this is we can sort of burn through a lot of these slides fast, but this is just a very rudimentary setup of a mining rig, a home mining rig. This, it used to be maybe 6 or 7 years ago, you could actually make some real money from having something like this. But as more people participate, it gets harder and harder to validate the transaction for any individual, and that's part of the beauty of the Bitcoin network. So it ends up costing more and more and more to validate, and there's all sorts of potential environmental issues because it's a lot of energy, and that's why you have different mechanisms like proof of stake and other delegate proof of stake and other mechanisms that have come up so you don't have the energy process. The other thing that we'll say, because we're saying visualizing the blockchain, is that the blockchain is not the only type of database out there that basically solves this double spend problem, which is what the Bitcoin blockchain is. There's something called Hashgraph. There's something called a dongle, or DAGs, which are what a coin called IOTA uses. So we sort of lump a lot of things into blockchain, but there's some nuance out there, but we're probably not going to get to too much of it here.
So ultimately, why should we care about blockchains? It's a different way of solving the trust problem. So, with blockchains, ultimately, you can build a decentralized system that allows you to transact without the third-party intermediary. So what are the things that you can apply blockchains to? So pretty much any multi-step transaction that requires traceability. We talked about supply chains. I've heard implementations of blockchain proposed for things like a new way to perform car leases, and we'll talk about smart contracts in a minute. Taking friction out of settling securities transactions. So there's a lot of different things, managing who owns property. So one of the proposals for blockchain, public blockchains are, it's really hard to validate titles of properties, but if titles of properties were stored on a blockchain, you may not need specialized companies just to validate who owns a particular title, and that could be very important in third world countries where you don't necessarily have access to that information, so readily and easily. So there's just like Justin was mentioning, there's a lot of different applications of blockchains. Bitcoin, obviously being the oldest and most mature one. Here's a couple of other examples put up on the screen. So one of the things that I like and propose about blockchain is it's promised to potentially give the access and control of information back to the individuals who originated. So one of the proposals of blockchain, particularly in healthcare and finance that I've seen is, if your health records information or your credit worthiness information, for example, was stored on a blockchain, and you had access to who you share that with and who can read it, then you would have less control over the monetization of your data, for example, which right now a lot of third parties will monetize your private data. But if you had control of it on the blockchain and who you shared it with, you get that power back.
Yeah, so look, there's a lot of information that you can find yourself about in what industries people are trying to explore how blockchain can create efficiencies. The more interesting question is when is blockchain not the answer? And the answer to that is almost always, because what a blockchain is it's a fairly inefficient database that, if implemented properly, will allow you to have a high degree of certainty in the validity of the data stored. So what types of applications can you create with that model? And I think it's when, this is my understanding of it and how I try to explain it, it's when security is more important than efficiency. So what types of data does that apply to? Well, obviously it applies to
security of validity and immutability is more important than efficiency.
Yeah. So what does that apply to? Well, it applies to money. It applies to
ownership.
Ownership of assets. So, for instance, title, right? Provenance of art.
Private information.
Maybe. But there might be ways of solving a lot of these problems without having to use a blockchain, because really the way a blockchain works is through the use of a cryptocurrency is usually needed for like game theory reasons, right? You want to reward people who have no actual interest in that data for participating in mining these things. So what you end up having, and we'll get to some of these questions, we're getting a lot of great questions, so continue bring them on and we'll try to answer them all at the end. But what you end up having right now is, I think there are 1,500, 1,800, 2,000 different cryptocurrencies. A lot of them are centralized. They're purporting to put some information or some service on a blockchain, in like air quotes, on a blockchain, but they're not able to achieve the network effect and the scale that a real public blockchain can. So the question is, do you need a private cryptocurrency because you want to put VIN numbers on a blockchain or something? And it's, well, you can create that, but you're making it actually less efficient to store that data. So there are ways that you can encrypt, and there are ways that you can secure data without having to go through a blockchain. And what I always say is, the people who are most interested in blockchain solutions at like major companies are the marketing departments, because it's a hot word, right? You can change the name of your ICT company to Long Island Blockchain, and it shoots up in value. So I think what you're seeing now is a lot of hype. It's sort of like the .com boom, right? In the next couple of years, these companies that have a blockchain solution to maybe a problem that didn't exist will start to go away, and you'll start to see real use cases. And there are several real use cases. And it's really when you need a third party to validate something that's very important. And there are all sorts of insurance applications and title applications and providence applications. But it's not a solution to everything, and we shouldn't think of it that way. And I'm just saying, I really love a lot of these questions that we're getting, so I'm going to
Go ahead, take some.
Should I take some? Okay. Well, so we won't get too far behind. We'll answer some of the easier ones first. When all 21 million Bitcoins are created, how will validation work? So basically, when a miner validates a transaction, there's really two payments they get. One is from the Bitcoin network, and those are the newly minted Bitcoins. And the other is that there's a small transaction fee from the people who are actually sending or receiving Bitcoin, the people sending Bitcoin. So what ends up happening is after all the 21 million Bitcoins are mined and they're not getting any fee from the network, what will end up happening is that the transaction fee per transaction may increase marginally to make up that amount. What are the backgrounds of the people who participate in the validation process of Bitcoin blockchain? That's a great question because it's completely open.
Right.
It's right.
Anyone with computer resources.
You guys can go on and download the protocol with a couple $100 worth of equipment, and sometimes even less, depending on how efficient you want to be. You can be a participant in the Bitcoin blockchain and in fact many other public blockchains. Isn't Bitcoin blockchain susceptible to a 51% problem? It's getting so big that it reduces numbers of miners, and therefore just a few big firms would be mined. Okay, this is maybe a little too technical, but a 51% problem means that the validation power becomes centralized in a few large firms that could theoretically, if it gets a bit large enough, create a false transaction and then self-validate that. And there's a lot of people who have written very articulately about this, about the game theory aspects of it. But basically, if I know that there's one company or one group of miners that has the ability to basically kill the security of the Bitcoin blockchain or any others, then that the value of Bitcoin is going to just drop to the ground. And another blockchain that has a more secure validation process will come up in its place. And in fact, a couple years ago, you saw a mining operation that got something like 30% of the hashing power, and they self-regulated because they didn't want there to be the perception of susceptibility. So let's go through this some more, and then we'll get back to some questions. But I'm enjoying the question answering. You can go into public-private.
So one of the things going into the section on public and private blockchains, so main differences between the two, and we've covered a little bit of that, is who can participate, who manages the nodes, monetary incentives, and visibility, security, and privacy. So here's a chart that I put up just to kind of highlight the main differences. And as you can see, the big differences is access. So private blockchains are not open to the public. They're only open to those who have permission to use it, and the participants who are either participating as in nodes or transacting. You need authentication or authorization to participate in a private blockchain. Monetary incentives are not as important in private blockchains because the nodes are being operated by whoever's managing the blockchain. And as such, it's also not open and transparent to the world because it's only meant to hold information for the participants. So ultimately, the centralized parties that manage the blockchains are the ones that really have the access, and the participants who have the access to the information.
So there's a question that maybe you can answer that relates to it. So Albert asks, who owns and controls the information in a blockchain? Sounds all nice, but who wants to just store information without someone verifying its authenticity and controlling who can post and who not and who can see, etc.?
So in private blockchains, it's the operators of the blockchain. So whoever created it and the nodes that operate it. Those are the ones that control the access to the data and the validity of the data. In public blockchains, it's again the participants of the node, but the data is open.
Yeah, so and it makes sense in applying it to something like a currency. right? Where you want to make sure that the entire monetary supply is
understood
accurate,
and active, right? And you know where everything goes.
It makes sense when you want to apply it to like title records.
Right.
It makes less sense, I think, when you want to apply it to, I pick on it, but like a decentralized bus system where you have your bus tickets on a blockchain. At that point, okay, it's public, right? I guess the public owns that information, but it maybe doesn't need it, and there might not be actual incentives to keep it accurate, because why do you want bus token coin, right? Or whatever it is. So yeah, so I think that's pretty good. Smart contracts.
So a little bit about smart contracts. So smart contracts is a feature of blockchains that was added sometime after. In essence, it allows automations that occur when transfer of assets happen. So one example in the cryptocurrency space are initial coin offerings. So initial coin offerings are ways that companies can raise funds, and smart contracts are used so that when you transfer funds to the company raising the funds, the smart contract can execute and return back, tokens that represent what you've bought into.
Sure. So let's take a step back from initial coin offerings, and so all a smart contract is it's neither smart nor a contract. It is code, right? It's this idea that developed several years ago that code is law. If I write something into a blockchain that is an executable program, and that is immutable, it means that it cannot be broken. So therefore, you can call that a smart contract because it's impossible to breach a smart contract, right? That's not always accurate, and we've seen instances.
Well, like you can have bugs in the code itself.
Sure, and that's a reason why a smart contract is not always a proper solution, because there are reasons why you would want to breach a contract. There are good reasons why you would want to breach a contract, and that's what the law has developed to determine. Okay, what are the
and it isn't always desirable that whatever's written into the contract execute immediately.
No, but I mean, I can create a smart contract that allows me to do it at whatever timetable I want. But all a smart contract is it's a piece of code that says at some point X happens, or when X happens, Y will happen, and it's written into a blockchain. And there are really interesting reasons why you would implement this. And here's one of my favorites. And we will share the slides when we're done. For Alexander who asked. Pari-mutuel contracts, which are pari-mutuel insurance contracts, are very interesting, because what it says is that regardless of harm and regardless of fault, when something happens, there will be a payout. So for instance, if I'm a farmer, I could have a pari-mutuel contract for my crops in the instance of frost. So I could create on a blockchain that's either public blockchain or one that's federated amongst insurance companies, a pari-mutuel contract that says that once the system recognizes that the GPS coordinates of my farm, as verified by NOAA, which can tell me exactly when it gets below a certain degrees and frost conditions occur on that GPS coordinate, as soon as that happens, it triggers an automatic payment to me as the farmer for whatever the pari-mutuel contract allows as the output. That's an instance where otherwise, if you didn't have a smart contract, I would need, as the farmer, to say, oh, it's mighty cold out. Let me call my insurance company. The insurance company will then send someone out to my farm, or they'll go and check all the data, and you have all of these inefficiencies. And those inefficiencies cost the insurance company money, and they ultimately cost me as the person who has insurance money. So that's an example of how a smart contract can be actually applied in the real world. There are a ton of reasons why you would not want a smart contract. One of them is just simply human error. If I create a smart contract that's on an immutable blockchain, and I mess that up in some way, and someone loses millions and millions of dollars because of it, there's not a way to undo it. There's no redo button. You can go to a court if you want, and good luck having a court. Yeah. So there's going to be an increase in the need for quality assurance
For smart contract
providers, right?
Well, and ultimately, the last bullet here is really meaningful. They don't replace legal contracts; they're only automated execution.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a contract like a lawyer would typically think. It's really more just a procedure of coding. So that smart contract, there are blockchains that are created to facilitate those types of contracts. So, for instance, the Ethereum blockchain. There's another one that's sort of based on Ethereum called EOS. There's something called NEM, and they're trying to create this ability to automate a lot of our day-to-day lives. Now, with regard to initial coin offerings, that is a way for people to really, I don't really see it as directly related to smart contracts. They involve some
smart contracts enable them.
Yeah, I mean, they involve some smart contracts and how they're applied, but initial coin offerings are really an alternative fundraising mechanism that uses tokens in order to bootstrap basically the development of an ecosystem, and we'll talk about that. Jose just asked, are smart contracts binding? And the answer is practically yes, but you're probably using the term binding as a legal contract, right? And they could be. I mean, I could create a smart contract that is legally bound, but it is just a piece of code. So if you see a train, hurtling toward the station, is it bound to go to the station? Well, not by law, maybe, but it's going there. So in some ways, the law has to adapt to these different types of instruments, and ultimately, that's really a question of liability. At what point does someone who create a smart contract that has some misstep in it, at what point are they actually responsible for the misstep? And then you probably just apply regular negligence principles to it, right? Were they negligent in creating the contract?
So here's a fun example I like to think about. So, ways that into like a car lease of the future, right? Car company uses the blockchain to accept digital payment, and customers might send their payments into a smart contract address that automates the terms of the lease agreement. Smart contract code can be triggered if the payment hasn't been received by a certain amount of time and can safely deactivate the car. Sending in a payment triggers another part of the smart contract that gets the car running again. So far on example, but it's one that's possible with smart contracts.
Yeah. So I don't think we need to go through so much of these. I think
do you want to talk a little bit about cryptocurrencies? Do you have a lot of information on that? Sure.
And we'll talk a little more about this when we get to the regulation side, because I think it's really a factor of regulation. But a cryptocurrency definitionally is just something usually associated with a blockchain or something similar to a blockchain that is traded on a secondary market, right? So there are a lot of reasons why you want to have something like that. You can have currencies like Bitcoin, whose only purpose is really to act as a payment system. Yep. You can have currencies like Ethereum, right, or Ether, which is basically used as the gas to run smart contracts, right, or decentralized applications. You can have cryptocurrencies that are really more asset-backed, right? So, for instance, a currency that's linked to some dividend for a real estate portfolio. But really, it's
or a tokenized version of an asset.
Yeah,
real estate property.
Yeah, tokenized version for an asset. But really, there are very different types of technologies and types of use cases that are all sort of lumped together because they're traded in a similar way on secondary markets by people who are investing. And one of the problems I think a lot of people have is they get into it from my little cousin put in $100 worth of Bitcoin in 2010 and now he's a millionaire. And they think, well, what's the next cryptocurrency?
Right.
And the problem from an investor side, frankly, is that it's very difficult to get information about some of the companies that are offering cryptocurrencies because there's so much money in the system. There's a lot of fraud. So there's an increasing sort of need for regulation on how these tokens are being offered and what they do. And when we talk about the regulation in a couple minutes, we can, I'll tell you the SEC has actually just sort of weighed in a very positive way in some regards, where they said that, look, we understand that this technology is new, and we understand that it has a lot of potential, and we're not looking to just regulate for the sake of regulation, because we don't want innovators to
Be stifled, yeah.
well, we don't want innovators to force their new innovations into existing regulatory models or regulatory models that we may not really understand the implications of. So there's a lot of different cryptocurrencies, and there's 2,000 cryptocurrencies, something like that, and a new one pops up every minute. And they're not all equal, but that's really more on the, I'd say, token economics and investment side than maybe what we should be talking about today. Before we get to challenges, let's answer some more questions because they're starting to pile up. These are more fun to go through. Okay. Is it still profitable to mine Bitcoin? Maybe, you should look that up. Next question. Which major companies are interested in developing solutions using blockchain? There are, so many. So for instance, Facebook just hired a number of executives to focus on blockchain solutions, and really sort of with an eye on data privacy. Oracle just announced a couple weeks ago that they were going to start offering sort of a blockchain as a service platform.
And there are several of those.
Yeah,
There's IBM, Hyperledger.
Yeah, so it's really, every logistics company who's a real player is looking at how to put basically shipping manifests and inventories on a blockchain. So there's quite a lot. You can look this up.
Well, software vendors like IBM and Microsoft are all looking to create platforms to build blockchains on top of.
Okay, isn't blockchain technology finite because of the prohibitive energy requirements? So that's actually a really good question. And then Matthew also asked something similar about, right now he says, Bitcoin was ranked 74th in the world at 32,000 carbon emissions annually. So this is a criticism that a lot of people have, is that in order to validate the Bitcoin network, it takes a lot of energy. And there's two ways of looking at this. The first, or maybe three. The first is to say, yeah, there really is too much energy being used, and therefore we should maybe adopt a consensus mechanism that doesn't require that much energy. So you have blockchain alternatives such as Hashgraph or DAGs or dongles that use less energy to validate. You also have different consensus mechanisms like proof of stake, which is what Ethereum right now is proof of work, but they're looking to go to proof of stake really because of these environmental concerns. There's another theory, and this is really espoused by a guy named Andres Antonopoulos, who's probably the greatest thinker in the Bitcoin blockchain world right now, and that is proof of work and the energy used is actually basically energy arbitrage across the world. Because what's happening is you have places like China, right, where they have the ability of creating a ton of energy, and they are creating a ton of energy, but there's not enough infrastructure to actually use that energy. So Bitcoin miners are going to places where there's more energy created than are being used, and that's the reason why energy costs are low. And they're going there and they're making up that
difference.
That difference. So there's actually some benefit to having this. The other thing that people don't necessarily take into account is that if I no longer need a third-party validator to validate transactions, then I'm getting rid of all the infrastructure costs that go into that third-party validation. So for instance, think about Visa, for example. How much energy does Visa use per year in order to act as a worldwide payment network? It's a lot. So if you're able to really scale Bitcoin to the point where you're validating just millions of transactions or billions of transactions a year, maybe there's a way of offsetting it. But there's a lot written about it.
Some of that is just in the technology enhancements to the Bitcoin network.
Yeah, so we're probably not going to go into too much, but there's always been a problem with Bitcoin speed because it is so secure and it requires so much validation that you just can't process transactions as fast as you could with Visa. They're more secure than they would be with Visa, but it's slower. So there are a number of scaling proposals. One of them, which is currently implemented and it's really amazing, is called the Lightning Network. There's all sorts of others that are being proposed, but that's sort of for another day. And then there's a number of questions about regulations, which we'll get to at the end. And then someone wrote, hello, is it worth to do mining today? And I would say, maybe.
Depends how much you put into it. So this is a really interesting part, and something that's really important is, the regulations around Bitcoin. I think everyone, because it's so new, everyone's struggling with just even the definition of it. So I know Justin knows a whole lot about this, so we'll let him get onto it.
Yeah, so this is really what I do on a daily basis, is think about how to go about regulating these technologies and trying to apply existing regulations to what is a very and often misunderstood technology.
Well, what you're saying is something I'm really interested about. Over regulation sometimes stifles or slows down innovation in the blockchain space.
Yeah. So here's a fairly good example. Like right now, I'm the author of a treatise for Westlaw that goes through all 50 states regulations on the state side, and I sit on a board of lawyers that was contacted by the Florida State Senate to think about regulations that Florida should adopt. And there's so much excitement about Bitcoin or blockchain that the regulators or the politicians, they really want to do something, right? They want to do something because this is the area that everyone wants them to do it. So they want to appear. A friend of mine has the term crypto woke, right? We know about blockchain. We're regulating. We're doing all we can. And the problem is that you try to define blockchain, and it's actually very difficult because a blockchain is just a very specific type of database that's sometimes associated with a cryptocurrency. But
all those technologies that are mentioned, they're all lumped into the definition.
Yeah, they're all lumped in. I can create a piece of blockchain legislation that will exempt all sorts of things that are similar to blockchains, but not actually blockchains, and it becomes a disaster. So what we're seeing as the challenges for regulating it is not defining what we're trying to regulate with enough nuance, so as to harm applications that we don't wish to harm, or to allow applications that we don't wish to allow. So let's move on, and we'll. Okay. So at a federal level is where it gets pretty interesting, because you have different federal agencies that are either claiming or not claiming jurisdiction on different aspects of Bitcoin or blockchain or cryptocurrencies, as well as all the different states that are also trying to create their own set of laws. So we'll go through just very quickly, and this is going to be more for if there's any lawyers on the call, I think. But we'll go through just generally how are people talking about this technology at the regulatory level. So at a federal level, and also at the states, it's a complete battle royale. So FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, views at least some cryptocurrencies as a currency and requires those who issue those currencies to be money service, to register as money service businesses and apply with all sorts of bank secrecy acts and whatnot. The IRS views at least some of the cryptocurrencies as property, and you have to pay capital gains taxes. Now, they have not done, I think, enough to really figure out, well, are all of them property? Are some of them maybe currencies, or some of them maybe commodity, right? So where there's not enough guidance.
There's a cat and mouse game too in the industry where things like, for example, utility tokens, I think sometimes were created.
Yeah, and
in some cases, particularly to get around being considered property.
Well, maybe, and we'll talk about utility tokens in a second, but that brings us into the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC is involved in regulating the sale of securities. Well, there's been a definition of what an investment contract is for since the late 40s, and we've been applying this this Howey test. And there's an ongoing question about at what point is a cryptocurrency a security, at what point is it not a security, at what point does it change, if any, from a security to a not-security. The CFTC views at least some cryptos as commodities, and the states do everything under the sun. So just going through a little, with a little more detail, FinCEN is under the Department of the Treasury. It's basically concerned with making sure that it stamps out money laundering. It makes sure that you're not funding terrorism. And they were actually the first federal entity that went after a crypto company. They went after a company called Ripple. And this was in, I guess, 2015. And they charged them about $700,000 fine. And basically what they said was Ripple, which is a centralized company,
right,
which issued cryptocurrencies. They said, well, look, you're basically issuing a stock. No, not stock. You're issuing a currency. You're a money service business. You need to comply with Bank Secrecy Act. You need to make sure that you're doing enough from the AML and the KYC side. And I expect over the next several years, FinCEN to be a major player on the enforcement side, because there are just a ton of companies issuing their own tokens to just anyone in the world who they want. And FinCEN is going to be concerned because some of that money could be used for naughty things. The IRS, we already sort of went into this. They generally, it's pretty clear, they view pretty much all cryptocurrencies as property, meaning you need to pay capital gains taxes on it. Now, this is a nightmare for a lot of people in the cryptocurrency world because they don't allow you to buy like-kind exchanges. Yeah, like-kind exchanges, right? So if I have Bitcoin and I want to buy Ethereum with it, right, well, that's now a taxable event. Right. Or if I bought Bitcoin at $10 and now it's worth $10,000 and I want to go and buy a computer with Bitcoin, I now have to pay capital gains as well as sales tax and all sorts of things.
Right, for the conversion of Bitcoin into the currency it was used.
Yeah, so it becomes very difficult. And I think ultimately if Bitcoin or any of the cryptocurrencies are to become legitimate currencies, the tax treatment needs to change, because at this point it's sort of untenable.
And this created actually a lot of issues for people that didn't, until late in the year last year, the question of like-kind exchanges wasn't clarified. So
yeah.
A lot of people were operating under the premise that crypto to crypto was a like-kind exchange. It was not taxable.
Yeah, and I think, we'll see what the IRS does in terms of enforcement over the next couple of years for that. But they've, subpoenaed Coinbase, which is, really the go-to for a lot of retail investors on how you purchase tokens, and they subpoenaed them for records of anyone who I think bought or sold more than $20,000 worth of crypto in 2017.
And that might include where they transferred it out from Coinbase too.
Yeah, you can track a lot of that. There's some open questions about things like forks and airdrops and maybe how you determine the base value for mined coins versus bought coins, but this is probably beyond today's discussion, but you can send me an email if you want more information about it. The CFTC is interesting. For those of you who don't know, commodity is basically any raw good as defined, except, and this is true, onions and movie tickets. Onions can never be a commodity for whatever reason. The CFTC views virtual currencies as commodities. They don't really make any nuanced distinction between what is or is not a virtual currency, or what types of virtual currencies may not be considered commodities. And in 2018, the Eastern District of New York agreed that virtual currencies are goods and therefore fall under the CFTC's jurisdiction. And that's important. That's important because the Commodities Exchange Act only regulates the sale of derivatives of commodities, but if something is commodity and there's fraud, the CFTC has jurisdiction. So by calling all virtual currencies commodities, the CFTC can actually go after and prosecute frauds. Now, the next slide, I think, is the SEC, and this is sort of where everyone's mind is right now, is at what point do you have something that you're issuing that's a token, and it's a security or not? Right. And so I imagine that there's going to be a question of, well, is Bitcoin a security? And the answer is no. Right? How can it be a security? There's no issuer, right? It can't be an investment contract because no one initially purchased it from the Bitcoin company. There's no Bitcoin company, it's just an open protocol. But there are a lot of companies. So for instance, I could create Justin Coin and I could say, hey, Wadi, this coin is going to be the next Bitcoin. It's going to be used at some point. You're going to be able to use it on the Justin network. But buy it now for this discount, and then it'll be worth 10 times as much later. Well, that's clearly an investment. The contract is going to be, the coin is going to be worth more money if I am able to fulfill my promise of building out this Justin network, and that looks a lot like a security. But let's say a year later, the network is running,
Right.
and that token now has use, and you need that token in order to use it. Is the token still security?
Right.
And that's a question.
Well, that's why I think a lot of companies are doing that, separated utility tokens, which I think you'll talk about in a minute, from the tokens that we use to buy into funding
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's difficult from the SEC's perspective because they're not used to a situation where something, really changes from one characterization to another. This is a new type of question. So we've had some statements over the last couple months from the SEC where they've acknowledged the premise that perhaps something can start out as an investment contract and then, due to external factors, become a not security. The SEC doesn't use the term utility. That's an industry-created term, but there's security or not utility. But that's an open question. And really what the SEC is trying to do right now is they are trying to go after fraud, right? There's a lot of people who've been attracted to the space because there's so much money and there's so much misunderstanding, and they try to create their own token and they create their own currency, and they're not, giving the disclosures you need when you're selling security. I mean, from a regulatory lawyer's perspective, it's very easy to know what you need to tell someone when you're trying to sell, one of these tokens. But if I'm an entrepreneur and I think, well, this is a completely new revolutionary technology, I may be acting without advice of counsel, or I may be acting, just to get to market as fast as possible and dealing with the results. And the SEC is really, has started looking at like the real bad actors who was really manipulated the market, who was really committed just outright fraud. They apply to the test for whether something is a security or not is called the Howey test. It's basically 4 factors: whether it's an investment in money in a common enterprise with the expectation of profits derived solely by the efforts of others, and that's usually the efforts of the issuer of the token. There's just a barrage of literature about applications of Howey tests to cryptocurrencies that you guys can find online, or if you want, you can email me and we can chat about it. Again, utility tokens are basically a token that's needed to run a blockchain ecosystem. Often they are used as a fundraising mechanism to go around venture capital. So traditionally, if I wanted to build a technology, I would, get a group of people together, create maybe some preliminary code or a business plan, and then I would go to a VC, and they would say, okay, here's $1 million, and I want 30% of the company, or whatever it is, and it's hard, right? It's difficult to get that money. It takes a long time. There's a lot of due diligence. I now need a lawyer before we get it. It's very difficult. So these initial coin offerings,
It's VC through crowdfunding.
it's VC through crowdfunding. The problem is that there's a way of doing crowdfunding, but there are limits. There's a way of issuing securities to the public, but there are a lot of regulatory burdens that you have to comply with. So the utility token is basically, look, eventually, this is the example I just gave. Eventually, the Justin coin is going to be used on the Justin network. But it's not yet, so just pre-buy it, and I'll use the money that you paid for it in order to build the network. And at that point, he's probably purchasing it as a security, but at some point, maybe it'll be utility. And right now, the only jurisdiction in the United States is Wyoming, who has actually recognized something called a utility token. They've defined it under their state securities laws. The problem with that, though, is that it only applies if you're only selling things in Wyoming. Right. And I there's probably more people on this call than there are in Wyoming. So I won't go through all the states, but there's just every single state has a different scheme regulating virtual currencies, and maybe can we send an email to all the participants?
Absolutely.
Maybe what I'll do is I'll send everyone my guide to
Yep.
the 50 states so you can see basically what all the states are doing. But there's really, the approaches on both sides are New York and Wyoming, right? New York was the first to create a broad cryptocurrency regulation, and they created something called a bit license. And it was really hard to comply with. Very few companies have been able to get bit licenses. It puts a lot of AML and KYC requirements on services that you probably don't need that in order to prevent, money laundering and terrorism. And it's driven business away from New York. There's currently a proposal in the New York State Assembly to basically override the application of the bit license, but still, it's very, very difficult to operate a crypto business in New York. Wyoming has taken the opposite approach, and they're trying to get people obviously to come to Wyoming, but they've created a utility token regulation that exempts certain types of tokens from the state's security rules. They exempt virtual currencies from the state's money transmission rules. And it's very difficult if you're a company that you're trying to create basically a distributed product that's going to be used by people in all 50 states. It becomes very, very difficult to comply with all the rules because every state and every aspect of the federal government treats you so differently. And I mean, as a lawyer in this space, it's nice because they're, in some ways we're the gatekeepers of how do you understand these things. But ultimately, there needs to be more consistency if the industry is ever gonna take off. I think that's it. I want to go through some of these questions that will and keep them coming. How much more time do we have?
But we're over time, but I think we can continue going for a little bit longer.
Sure. Okay. Working on okay, anonymity and ownership. So there's really a false sentiment that Bitcoin is anonymous. It's not. It's pseudonymous, meaning that I can send a transaction to any of you, and you can track that transaction on blockchain.info. And it's true, it doesn't say my name on it, but with basic forensics, you can track that down to an ingress or egress to fiat currency, like US dollars. Because usually, if you're trying to go in or out of Bitcoin through a money service business or a money transmitter regulated under state law, you need to provide identity information. So it's really not anonymous. It's not the greatest tool for illegal acts. There are, however, cryptocurrencies that have been developed and that are being developed that are more privacy-based. So there's one called Monero, which uses a technology called ring signatures. There's one called Zcash that uses something called a zero-knowledge proof. There's something called Dash, which started out as a coin called Darkcoin that basically tumbles transactions in order to obfuscate the people who are participating in the transaction. So there are people who see a great value, and I'm one of them. I think there's a great value to having an anonymous coin because it allows you to transact without having any repercussion. That, for instance, if I want to donate to a political party, and I don't want anyone knowing that I'm donating to that political party because there might be repercussions from my society, it makes sense to have a coin that allows for that. I come from a First Amendment background, so to me, the idea that money is speech, I really actually believe that. I believe that you need money to buy information. So there's a great benefit to having an anonymous token. The downside of it, of course, is that it allows people to transact in things that we don't want as a society. But you know what the best currency there is to buy drugs in the world is?
Cash.
Cash, baby. All right.
Here's a good one for you, and maybe we'll end it with this one. Speaking of regulation, do you think international regulation is only a matter of time? In light of countries like Russia supporting the technology, which some believe is a way to skirt international sanctions with regular currency, how will it impact the crypto community?
Sure. So it's interesting. It's very difficult, I think, for any country really to regulate the technology, right? It's hard to say, we're regulating a database because it's very difficult to define it. What you can regulate, however, are basically money transmission. How do you go in and out of a currency? And what you're seeing for the first time is really global regulation impacting the development of where industries sort of pop up. So you're seeing, in the same way you saw crypto companies leave New York when New York started regulating and go to jurisdictions that are more favorable, right? You're seeing that at a nationwide level as well. So I think
Switzerland is purporting itself as a haven for cryptocurrency.
Yeah, but there's Switzerland and Gibraltar, and there's all sorts of countries that are saying, you know, we want these types of business. We think this is good for our economy, and ultimately, you know, the larger world governments are going to be paying attention because it behooves the United States to have a robust technology sector. And if this is where technology is going, then just trying to regulate it out of existence is untenable because you don't need to operate in the United States to operate a global business, especially if it's on, you know, the platform itself is decentralized.
Right.
There's no reason to tie it into the United States sometimes if it's going to basically cost you so much money that you can't operate. That being said, money transmission rules, the SEC's regulations, most federal rules are extraterritorial in application, meaning you can't really hide in Malta and then sell securities into the United States. The SEC still has jurisdiction over you. You may say, well, good luck going to Malta.
Right.
Well, I think Malta has an extradition policy, first of all. But second, if you have, you know, your parents in Florida, you know, good luck, you know. So I think, like, to some degree, you know, you're going to see how the world treats crypto impacting how every individual country treats crypto. But still, there's a lot that the U.S. can do on a regulatory side to make it difficult for the community to grow and the industry to grow. But so far, to the federal government's benefit, they've taken a pretty soft approach, and I think a wait-and-see attitude, and haven't been that distrustful of the industry.
So with that, we'll close out. I want to thank Justin for joining me and us, and thank you all for attending. I know I've learned a lot, and hopefully you have too. And please send us any more questions via email. Our contact information is available for you, and we will send out the document Justin was talking about with the information regulation for the states. And
we'll put our public key, so if any of you want to tip us in Bitcoin, we'll take it.
Absolutely, we'll take it.
Yeah.
Thank you.